So I popped into Designer here and I've just gone up and started a new file here with our custom template. And if you don't have this template, make sure to check out the description where you'll be able to see the video where we can actually make our own. And so I typed in grass tutorial for this package and I just hit OK. And I'm going to start off by creating a shape node. So I'm going to come in here, create a shape node there. And I'm just going to plug this guy into our histogram range and our normal. And I'm going to come over to our base material here. I'm just going to right click and drag that into our viewport. So it's going to show up in our view here. If we take a look, we're not going to see anything because we've got our shape set to a square. And so it's just going to be pure white. So if I come into pattern here, I want to go down to paraboloid. And so this is going to give us a little bit of a fall off, you can see there. And so with that, I want to go ahead and increase the normal. And this is going to really help us see the light reflections of our material. So I'm going to bump this up to about 10 to start. And this is going to be not too bad of a starting point. The last thing I want to do is take full advantage of our height map, because right now we are not actually displaying any height information. So what I want to do is come up to materials and I want to go to edit. And I'm going to come down to height and scale and just drag that guy all the way up. And you can see our materials kind of slunk into our object here because we're using, we take a look, parallax occlusion mapping. And so it's just going to give us a little bit of a fake looking height map, or a little bit of a fake visualization of what we're doing for our height. Okay, and so the reason that I started with a shape node is because I want to start by creating the blades of grass. So I'm going to drag this guy over so we have a lot of room to work with here. And I want to start by coming down to our size. And we're going to get our size X and Y, and this is going to allow us to kind of reshape or scale our paraboloid here. And so I'm going to bring this guy down to about, close to about 0.15. And that's going to give us just kind of that nice thin blade of grass look. And over top of this, I'm going to add a transformation 2D because I only really want about the half and up of this shape here. So I want to get rid of the bottom half. So what I'm going to do is come into our transformation parameters over here. And I'm going to move it down on the y-axis till it's about, I'm going to say about 0.25, negative 0.25 there. And so that looks pretty good, except we run into the issue where now it's going to tile on our texture here. And you can see that it starts to, once the texture gets pushed down, it's going to start tiling from the top. And in order to fix that, all we have to do is come into our, again, transformation 2D here and come up to tiling mode. We want to make sure that we set this to absolute. Right now it's relative to input. And then just come into our drop down here and hit no tiling. And so now we're just going to get our one blade of graph, and it's not going to tile from the horizontal or vertical axis. So with that, now I want to come in and I want to start by creating a kind of a crease down the middle of our blade of grass here to kind of give it that folding effect that you see on a lot of little leaflets of grass. So I'm going to add a gradient linear 3 here. And the reason I'm doing this gradient linear 3 is because you can see it's got that nice sharp kind of point to it right down the center of the texture. And so with that, I'm going to come into its rotation and I want to rotate this 90 degrees. And you can kind of start to see what I'm going to do with this, where I'm going to basically overlap this over top of our grass texture here. So I want to transform. I'm going to add a blend node because I want to blend these two together. And so I'm going to take our gradient and pop it in over top. And so now there's one final thing I want to do to our gradient linear before I finalize the blend. And I want to add a gradient map onto the chain here. And making sure that it's set to grayscale, I want to come in and I want to get these two handles here just by clicking on our spectrum. And I'm going to bring this guy right up. And you can see what that's doing is essentially it's mimicking that of a levels node where I've got all this black, which is just going to be flat. And then right down the center, we're going to have this little tiny incline here. And you can see what I want to do with that is I want to switch the colors. And you'll see in a second where I switch this guy to white and I bring the middle right down to black. So instead of coming up in the center, I want it to be down in between, or I want it to be a bit of a recess right in the middle there. And so when I come back to our blending mode here, I want to go over to our blending mode option and I'm going to hit multiply. And you can see what it's done is it's taken all of the white values from this and overlaid it over top of this, removing any of the lighter values and only keeping the darker value right down in the center there. And you can see if I play around with our gradient here, we can affect the intensity of our centerpiece. And you can see we can make it very sharp, but I want to dial that back just a little bit so it's nice and smooth. I also want to come back into our blend here and I want to change the opacity down just so that it's not too sharp. And I'm going to probably bring that down to about 0.6. So we're getting a nice little leaflet of grass there. The next thing I'm going to do is just add a levels node on top of our blend. And I'm going to come into our value outputs here and I'm going to just bring down the white. I want to kind of flatten the overall color value of our height for our leaf here, or our grass blade here, just so that we're not getting something too contrasted. Because for the most part, blades of grass are pretty flat. And that's looking pretty good. So the next thing that I want to do with our grass is I want to add another gradient over top of our grass to make it look like the bottom is a little bit darker, a little bit recessed in, and the blade of grass at the top is a little bit brighter in value. And this is going to make it look like the grass is going to be coming out of the ground or another clump of grass. So the way that we can do that is I'm going to add a gradient linear 1. And you can see that this is just a straight gradient. And over top, I'm going to add a levels node. And we'll see what the levels node is going to be for in just a second here. So back on our grass here, I'm going to add another blend. And with this blend, I'm going to plug in our gradient. And I'm going to come down to our blending mode and hit overlay. And so now when I play around with the levels, you can see that as I'm increasing the white value, it's increasing the value towards the top end because we've got our whiter value at the top here. And if I increase our darker value, it's going to eat away at the bottom of our texture. And so what I want to do is play with our mid-gray a little bit just to make everything a little bit whiter. Increase our white a little bit, and maybe increase our black a little bit more too, to make it look like it's getting kind of eaten away at the bottom of our grass here. And that's looking pretty cool. And now the last thing I want to do with our leaf here is I want to go in and I want to start warping it, and I want to make 2 variations of our grass just so that we're not getting the same looking grass all over our material. So with that, I'm going to add a warp node. And I'm going to add in a Gaussian noise. And it's a pretty standard warp where I'm just going to strictly warp around our grass leaf here. with some procedurally generated Gaussian noise. And so it's a little bit too intense. I'm going to come down and change the scale. I also want to change the disorder a little bit. And if we take a look, that looks pretty cool for a blade of grass. What I'm going to do is just highlight these two here, hit Control D, duplicate these guys down here. And doing the same thing I did up top, I'm just going to play around with the intensity a little bit, play around with the scale, as well as the disorder. And that looks a little bit too intense. So drop that down. And so we've got some cool looking grass leaves that we're going to be able to tile and create a nice looking grass pattern with. And so a little bit of setup before we go ahead and create the tile of our grass here. I'm going to come up just over top. And I'm going to use this space to create a vector scale and mask for our leaves here so that we're going to be able to tile around them and also use them as a scale reference and mask. And you'll see once we create it and then add it to our tile sampler what the effect is going to be. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a plasma node. I'm just going to hit F to zoom in there. And so this is going to be the basis of what we're going to use to kind of tile the leaves around, or the grass blades. And so I'm going to come to our scale. And the first thing I want to do is just decrease the scale to make it a little bit bigger. And I'm going to come around and play with the disorder as well, just to find some different looking assortments than just the standard plasma. And so on that, I'm going to add a levels node here. And with the levels node, I'm going to come in and take our high value here, our white value. I'm going to crank that right up so that we get a much brighter looking value. And so this levels right here is going to be both our mask and our scale map for our tile sampler here. And we're going to see what that actually does in just a minute. The last thing I want to do is take this levels and add a normal map to it, because we're going to use this as a vector map to kind of randomly displace and rotate our grass here. And again, I want to come into our intensity, just bump it up to something like 5 to make it a little bit more intense so we get some actual color values for our position. And now we're going to see how we can use these to shape and mold the position and rotation of our grass. So now that I've got that set up, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add a tile sampler. Now the first thing I want to do is come into our pattern on our tile sampler here, click on the pattern, and I'm going to hit pattern input. And so now it's going to allow us to plug in both of our grasses here and use these as inputs to tile around and provide new geometry for. So I'm going to click on our warp, plug that guy in, and you can see that it's going to tile our grass sample very, very finely, very small. And I can come down to our second warp here and drag this guy in. But you can see that we don't have another spot to put our second pattern input here. So if I release that and I come into our sampler, you can see right under our pattern, we have pattern input number. And if I just increase this up to 2, it's going to allow us to plug in a second texture. And it's already gotten rid of some of our first texture and just a random assortment of areas. So if I just click this guy, bring it into our warp, now we're going to get both of our warps tiling in our sampler here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take our sampler and plug them into both of our height and our normal here so that we're going to see what's going on. So right now the grass blades are a little bit too small for what I like. So I'm actually going to bump them up to about 10. And they're going to be very, very large. I'm also going to come into our scale random and do about 0.2. So this is going to randomly scale our grass here so that they're all not the same uniform size. I'm also going to come up to our size X and size Y, and I'm just going to decrease the size X to about 0.95 just to make it a little bit thinner. And I'm going to increase the length of our blades to about 1.5 just to make them longer. I also want to come into our size random, and I want to randomize the X of our leaves to about 0.4. So it's just going to randomly scale the leaves on the X value or the X axis. And I also want to do the same for the Y. I'm going to do about 0.25 just to add a little bit of variety to our leaves and a little bit more randomness in terms of their scale. The next thing I want to look at is this value down here called scale map multiplier. And if I increase it up, you can see that it's going to just scale everything uniformly. And the reason it does that is because if we come into our inputs, you can see we actually have a scale map input and we've got nothing plugged into it. So it's just going to be black or a null value. And that's why everything is going to be scaling at the same uniform value, because we're just only scaling it at one entire black value. So we need some variance in the color values in order to get the most effect of our scale map multiplier down here. So if I come back up to our vector scale and mask nodes here, I'm going to use the levels node as our scale map. So if I take this output, plug it into our scale map input, and then come back into our tile sampler, I'm going to scale the scale map multiplier up. And you can see not every leaf is going to be scaled the same way. And if I take a look, it's going to be based on our color values here. So once we continue playing around more, you're going to see and start to notice just how we can use these different maps and nodes to scale and rotate our grass blades very differently and very randomly. The next thing I want to do is start by playing around with our position here. And so I'm going to just add a little bit of position random, but I really want this to be directed or influenced by our vector map displacement. And you can see in our tile sampler that the vector map input is the only one that has a color value input. And so that's why we've created our normal map here, because it's going to give us a position value and a color output. So if I click on this guy and drag him in to our input here, and I come back down to our position, I'm going to click on our vector map displacement and bring that guy all the way up. And so now it's going to use these values to reposition all of our samples here, our examples of grass, and it's going to fit it along the position normals of our map here. As I come back into our tile sampler, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find our vector map multiplier. And so we can use the vector map that we've created, or the normal map, to influence both our position and our rotation of our grass. And so when I click and drag this multiplier all the way up, it's going to use the normals again to drive the rotation of each blade of grass. I'm going to come back up to our pattern amount here, and I'm going to do 200 by 200. And you can kind of see now what our maps are going to do is it's going to basically take on the form of the pattern that we've plugged in using both of our scale and our vector map here to really drive both the scale and the position and rotation of our tiles here. I also want to come back down, and I'm going to decrease our scale map multiplier to about 0.6. Actually, we'll do about 0.5 because I don't want it to be too heavily influenced by the scale. And now I'm finding our pattern to be a little bit too noisy. And again with that, what I'm going to do is take our levels here, and I'm going to come to our tile sampler, and I'm going to find where we have our mask map input. And so I'm going to plug that guy in, go all the way down to the bottom, and we're going to have a value called mask map threshold. And you can see as I increase that, we're really going to isolate those lighter values that we have on our mask or scale map here. If we take a look and compare, all of the darker values are going to be the areas that are going to get masked off first. And so I'm going to do a value of about 0.3 for now. It's going to give us some nice patchy blocks of grass. I'm going to come back up to our rotation. And as I play around with our rotation here, we're going to be able to kind of give a direction towards the grass. Also playing around with the rotation random just a little bit. And coming back down to our color here, I'm going to mask random, again, just to get a little bit more variety. Also color random, just to make sure that we get some distinct blades of grass. And I'm also going to come down to our color here, click on scale, and now when I drag this multiplier up, it's going to color everything based on the scale. So the smaller the tile is, the darker the value will be on that particular tile or blade of grass here. And it's a very subtle effect, but can help you really differentiate and add some more variety to each blade of grass. And so I'm going to come back up to our position tab here, and down at our vector map displacement, I want to bring that right down because I think it's a little bit too intense, and I want to have the blades of grass a little bit closer together, starting from a little bit more of a clumped area. And you can see that the more we bring this down, the more towards a certain area or cluster, an origin of where these blades of grass are going to start from, starts to resonate a little bit nicer. So now that we've got our grass completed, I want to go ahead and start working on kind of the ground that's going to be underneath all of this grass. And so a quick little trick that I like to do is I take a Clouds 1 node and I just add a directional warp. And all I do is just take the clouds and then I just plug it back in to the bottom area. And so this is going to just give us a little bit of a ripple effect, and it makes it a little bit more like it's kind of softer mud. And we can play around with the intensity, and that might be a little bit too rough. Maybe something like, we'll do 17. You can also change the direction. And again, I think that's going to be a little bit too noisy. I'm going to come down to try 15. And that's a little bit softer. And we can try working with that. So what I want to do with our ground here is I'm going to add a height blend node. And I'm going to take this guy and plug our grass right into the top, right there. I want to come into the height offset, and I want to bring this up because I want to work towards our grass popping over top of our dirt there. I also want to make sure that the contrast is at 1, and I'm going to settle on something like 0.9 for now. And I'm just going to shift left click and drag that into our height blend there, and I just want to see what this is going to look like on our mesh. And there's not as much grass as I was hoping. So what I want to do with that is I want to just add a levels node onto our grass here. And so instead of trying to manipulate it with our height offset or our height blend here, I'm just going to increase the white value of our grass just to help it pop through our light blend here just a little bit nicer. And so now we're getting some pretty nice grass. So now that we've gone ahead and created the blend between our grass and our ground, I want to go ahead and start creating new and different geometries that we can scatter across in between the grass and the ground there. And so I'm going to start by creating some nice fine little pebbles or rocks. I'm going to find some space up in here. And I'm going to start with a polygon 2. And immediately with this, what I'm going to do is Control D to duplicate. And I'm going to blend between these two. So if I take a look, nothing's going to happen because we've got two over top of each other and we're only using the copy blending mode. So realistically, we're only going to see the top node here. So what I want to do is I want to use this top node to cut away from our polygon 2 down here and just randomly kind of move it around to create some interesting different cuts to make it look more rock-like. So the first thing I'm going to do is in our blending mode, come down to subtract. And so now we should get nothing because we're basically subtracting all the white values here from all the white values here. And because it's a 1-to-1 pixel value, it's going to give us completely nothing. With that being said, I'm going to bring this polygon 2 back, use a transformation 2D here. And now if I double click on the blend and single click on our transform, as I move this around, you can see that it's going to cut away from our rock. I also want to randomize our polygons here a little bit so that they're not quite the same. So I'm going to decrease the size of this guy here, maybe scale it down a little bit, turn him around a little bit, and kind of round the curve so that we're getting something kind of like this. And we'll do the same for the polygon 2 up top here. So again, double clicking on blend. Maybe increase the number of sides, decrease the scale, give them a different rotation, and maybe decrease the curve as well to give it a little bit more rounded. And so we'll get something like this. And so now we can click and drag around just to give different random cuts. We can also come back up to tiling mode, hit absolute, and no tiling if we only want just the one and we don't want this to tile around and cut in different parts of our mesh. So I'm going to cut something like that. The next thing I'm going to do is bevel this so that we get a little bit more rounded and soft edges. And so I'm going to decrease the distance on that. Bring up the smoothing just a little bit. I'll do about 0.3. And I'm going to do the exact same thing as we just did with the cutting and subtracting. I'm going to Control D this guy here, plug him in over top, come down to subtract, and now if I move this guy around, we've got a nice looking, rounded and soft pebble. The next thing I want to do is bring this guy through a slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to use a fractal sum base. And I want to get some larger scale edge destruction in this rock. And so I want to increase our samples, really decrease the intensity here. I'm going to go to a min blending mode. And I'm going to come into our fractal sum here. I want to decrease the max level. There's something about, we'll do 7. You can increase the min level a little bit. And I think I'm going to just decrease the opacity and increase the roughness. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, again, shift click on this and plug it into our rock so that we're able to see what we're actually doing to this pebble here. I also want to come over to our histogram range here, and I just want to make sure that we bump this guy all the way up too, so that we're getting the full breadth of our height map and for all the color values that we have. And I think I'm actually going to change the mode to blur just so that we get a little bit of edge information on the in and outs. And I think I'm going to invert the roughness and the global opacity. Just to get some nice larger scale detail. And then I'm going to do slope blur once again. I'm going to control D the fractal sum here, making sure to come into our second slope, increase the samples, decrease the intensity, hit min, and now I want to really increase the sample values, or the min or max level here, something like that actually, just to level up. Play around with the roughness, just to add some minute detail. And that's looking like a pretty good rock. I want to come over to the bevel again because I feel like the fall off is a little bit too long. So I'm going to come to the distance and I'm just going to drag that down to maybe 0.15. And that's looking pretty good. So just like we did for the grass, what I want to do is I want to control and select all of this, and I'm going to hit Control D because I just want to get a little bit variety in the rocks that we have tiling. And so the first thing I notice is that we've got these two nodes here that we don't actually need to duplicate because I don't really care about the edge damage being the same, but more so just the overall shape of the rock. So I'm going to take these two and delete them. And I'm just going to plug these nodes in, and they're going to share the same fractal sum base nodes. And so what I want to do is just come back to these transforms, and I'm just going to move them and rotate them around so that they're cutting into the rock a little bit differently. And so now if we take a look, we've got two nice looking rock types. So now that we've got our rocks completed, I want to go ahead and tile them and then add them along in our height blend here. So I'm going to add another tile sampler node. And just like we did for the grass, I want to come to pattern, make sure that we have pattern input selected. And I also want to make sure that we're going to be able to input two different nodes here. So now that we've got these rocks, we can plug those guys in. And I want to start by plugging in our scale and mask and vector maps here. So I'm going to come back to where we've created them. I'm going to take our vector map or our normal map here, and I'll plug that guy into our vector. I'm going to come back to our scale and mask here. And I'm also going to plug this into scale and mask. And now the only problem that I can see right now with using the same mask is that when we mask off our rocks, we're going to get them masking off in the same areas, and so we're going to have our rocks overlapping with our grass. So what I want to do is I'm going to add an invert grayscale node. I'm going to take our mask here and plug it in, and then I'm going to use this to substitute both our mask and our scale map input. And this is just going to allow us to essentially mask off all the rocks that are going to be within the grass, and it's going to allow us to scale the rocks differently using the scale map multiplier because it's going to be inverted to what we did for the grass. So now coming to take a look at the rocks here, I immediately want to come in and just do 25 by 25 because I want to have a lot of rocks to tile over top of our material. I'm also going to come down to our size, and I'm just going to size it 1.5 on the X just to make it a little bit wider. And I want to, again, just like the grass, randomly size up the X to about 0.3, and I'm going to size up the Y randomly to about 0.1. I'm also going to bump the scale up to about 2.5. I'm going to randomly scale up our rocks again just to break up the uniformity. And I'm also going to use our scale map multiplier to really scale these rocks up depending on their geography. And you can see if I come into our scale here, the darker areas are going to have the smaller rocks, while the larger areas are going to have the brighter or bigger rocks, I should say. Now I want to come down to position, and I'm going to again just randomly rotate these rocks just to give it a start so that we're breaking up the uniformity of all of our rocks here. I'm also going to come down to our vector map displacement and just use our vector map to pretty much throw these rocks around. I can also come down to the rotation, play around with that, play around with our vector map rotation. Again, it's not going to do too much to our rocks, but just kind of randomly rotate them. And I'm also going to do rotation random just a little bit more, just to get a little bit more of randomness to our rocks. I'm also going to come down to our color now and start masking off some of these rocks. And you can see that it's going to start to do that in the darker areas of our map here. I also want to color random just a little bit to give it some random height. Maybe mask a few random off again. Coming back to scale just to make sure to color them according to their size. And now I'm going to add a height blend again. So taking our height blend down here, making sure that I plug this guy into the bottom input there, and I'm going to shift click and drag it to this output. And now I want to take our rocks and just plug it into the height blend there. And you can see all of the rocks that we're going to get from our tiles here. They're a little bit too pronounced. As well, I want to increase the contrast because you can see that the rocks are not going to blend too nicely with what's below them. So with the height offset, I'm going to just decrease these rocks a little bit, something like 0.2. We're going to get these rocks popping through. And I'm going to come back into our scale over here. Decrease the scale to maybe 2. I want to increase the scale random to maybe 0.55. And depending on how many rocks you want to have in your scene, you can come back down to your map here and you can start adding some back. So now that we've got our rocks added to our chain, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come and delete our base material because I want to start plugging everything into our final outputs. So I'm going to bring our normal map in, plug in our ambient occlusion, and I'm going to take our height and plug that guy in too. I also want to just plug in some placeholders, so I'm going to take our uniform color, make sure that's set to grayscale, and I'm going to set that up relatively halfway. Plug that into our color, hit Control D, plug that into our roughness, and once again hit Control D, and I'm going to plug it into our metallic. And with the metallic, what I'm going to do is bring this all the way down to black because we don't have any metallic properties on our material. And so black is going to indicate that nothing is going to be metal. So the first thing I'm going to be focusing on is our albedo map. And so normally what I do is I come back to our height map here, and I use this guy to plug in to our albedo. So I'm going to take that and just plug that guy in. And you can see that nothing's going to show up, and that's because we need to right click on our graph and we need to go view outputs in 3D. And so now all of our outputs are going to show up. And you can see that our height map is a little bit too tall. So I'm going to come back down to our height here. And I'm just going to decrease the range a little bit to about 0.85. And that's a little bit better. So now coming back up to our albedo here, I'm just going to get rid of this uniform color. And on top of our connection, I'm going to add a gradient map. And so this is how I block in the first initial colors of our material. And I want to start by creating our gradient map for our dirt and our mud background. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to hit Gradient Editor, and we're going to get this color spectrum. And so if we just click on this here, you can see that we're going to get our two handles to pop up, and this is going to allow us to play around with the color values. And so I want to take our black here, and I'm going to go up to a little bit of a darker brown. And I'm just going to plot that point on our color graph here. And the same thing for the white. I'm going to come up to a little bit of an orangier brown. Make it a little bit desaturated and a little bit brighter. And I'm going to come back to the dark, make that a little bit desaturated too. So we've got an initial start to the color, and you can see that we're getting a little bit of variation. However, it's also affecting our grass. So what I want to do is I'm going to Control D this gradient map, and I'm now going to add a blend onto this. And I'm going to plug these both in, and I'm going to find on our top gradient here a nicer greeny kind of color for our grass. So I'm going to come back into our gradient editor, just switching this up to green, a little bit of a lighter desaturated green. And again, the darker values to be a little bit of a darker green. I want to crank this up a little bit. So that we're getting some nice variation on our actual blades of grass here. And so now what we need to do is blend between these two gradient maps here. So what we can do is come back to our initial height blend here, where we blended together the ground and the grass. And if we take a look, you can see that we actually have an output called height mask. And this is going to be the mask between both of our ground and our grass here. So I'm going to use this and plug this guy into the opacity of our blend. And now we're going to get the separation of color values and gradient maps between our two materials. So now that I've got those separated, I want to go ahead and hash out the dirt and the grass a little bit more. So I'm going to move this back. And I'm going to Control D again on the dirt here. And I'm going to swap the positions of these just so that we have this guy underneath and we have this one over top. And so now I want to add a little bit more noise detail onto the dirt. And so with that, I'm going to put in a white noise fast because I like the little random specks that it gives us. So I'm going to plug that guy in there and take a look at this gradient map. And you can see it's going to give us a lot of different color values. And we can also come in here and play around with that and just add a little bit more variety to our color map here. And that looks pretty cool. So now I'm going to blend these two together. And so right now, all it's going to do is give us the top gradient map here because we have the blending mode set to copy. So we can also play around with different blending modes by just clicking and scrolling down and to see what different effects we get. And I'm going to stick with screen, but I'm going to decrease the opacity just so that we get a little bit of color information in our dirt here. And I'm going to stick with about 0.6. And now I'm going to come back up to our grass and I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to Control D. I'm going to blend them together and reconnect this output. So what I want to do with these guys is I want to just add a little bit more color variety and then I'm going to remask them so that we get a little bit of a different color balance on our leaves or our grass. So with the top one here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our lighter value and I'm going to bring it closer to a yellow to make it look a little bit more dead. And again, same thing, giving it just a little bit more of a worn color value. And you can see the difference between the two that we've got. And so now what I want to do is I want to make sure that the yellow color values and the more yellow color values are a little bit towards the end and the tops of our grass blades here, and the nice, fresh green are a little bit closer to the stems of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find where we have our grass. And I'm going to add a histogram select. And so when I plug this in, what it's going to allow us to do is essentially shift through the color values of our grass. And this is going to allow us to make a mask that's very position based on our grass here. So if I bring this back over and I plug that into the opacity, now we're going to be able to see as we play around with our position what it's going to allow us to do. You can also change the range and even bump up the contrast a little bit too. And you can see with the contrast, what it's going to do is just make a very sharp contrast between the two values, which is pretty much just a binary mask. So we want to leave this relatively low. So something like that looks good. It just adds a little bit more color variety to our grass blades here. And if we take a look at the blend, you can see that we're getting a little bit more of a worn effect. So it's not super fresh grass. So now I want to go ahead and start adding in some color to our rocks here. So I'm going to do the same exact thing where I just add another blend. I'm just going to Control D on the gradient map over here. And instead of plugging in our height map, what I want to do is instead plug in the actual tile sampler itself here, just so that we get a little bit of a nicer and clean selection for our rocks. And so I'm going to plug that into the gradient map, plug this guy into our blend, and then I'm going to come back to where we blended the rocks with the rest of our height, and again use the height mask that we have. So I'm going to quickly drag this over and plug this into our opacity, and now we're going to get our nice green rocks. So yeah, I'm not going to leave them on green. I'm going to come back to our gradient editor. I'm going to switch this to a little bit more of a bluish color, making sure to really desaturate that and darken it a little bit. And we're just going to use this as the foundation or base color of our rocks. And actually, I'm going to come back and really bring down the color values there, a little bit darker. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a flood fill node, because what I want to do is randomly select each one of these rocks and just add a different kind of color overlay over top to give it a little bit of variety in its color. And so what I'm going to do is draw again from our mask and use this as a flood fill. I'm then going to take our flood fill and add a flood fill to random color and just plug our flood fill into that guy. And you can see that we're going to get a bunch of different random colors for our rocks here. And the last thing I'm going to do is add an RGBA split. And this is going to allow us to separate all of the color channels into a different grayscale mask. And you'll see why we're going to use this in 1 minute. So I want to set up a few different colors that we're going to be able to use to colorize our rocks here. So I'm going to draw or drag in our uniform color here, and I'm just going to Control D and duplicate it to get about 3 different colors. And so the premise of this is I just want to add some, again, variety to these colors. So I'm going to pick a little bit of an off orange. For this one, I'm going to take more of a blue. And this one I'm going to take, we can go with a bit more of a greeny yellow. And so I'm going to add a blend. I'm also going to Control D and plug this into our start here. And actually I'm going to switch this guy to a different color as well. Go to a little bit more of an off purple. And so I'm going to plug these two in and try and blend them together. And you can see right now it's only going to show us the top uniform color until I take the red channel split from our RGBA split here. And you can see it's going to affect our rocks all differently, with white having more of an influence of the top and the darker blacker ones having more influence from the bottom texture here. So when I plug that guy in, all of a sudden we're going to get different color values showing up. And this is going to be the same for when we plug in our blue. And I'm going to use a green. So now we've got the brown to a certain extent from our first, the purple, and the blue. And the same thing again when we do our uniform color green. And I'm going to plug in our blue here. Now we're going to get a bunch of different colors for our rocks. So I'm going to drag that back, add another blend, and plug this in over top. Again, making sure to just Control click, and we're going to steal the mask from that previous blend and add it onto that one. So now we've got a little bit of a confetti or sprinkle looking rocks. And so I'm going to come back down and change the blending mode of this to be overlay. I'm also going to really decrease the opacity. I'm going to go about 2.25. And it's a very, very subtle effect, but you can see that it's added a little bit more variety to the colors of our rocks here. And so the next thing I want to do is I want to add some chipping damage to these rocks so that they're not just nice and smooth. And so where we can get this edge information from is right down here with our normal map. And so I'm going to add a curvature map, and we're going to be able to plug in our normal and get a lot of edge information and a lot of edge detail. And you can see right in here with the rock, we're getting a lot of that chipping edge wear. So I'm going to bring this up, and I'm going to add a levels node onto this guy. And so once I increase the white values and increase the black values, you can see that we're really only going to be left with the edge highlights where all of the edge wear is going to take place. And we're going to be able to use this as a mask. But in order to do so, I'm going to have to get rid of all the excess edge information because I only want to use it on our rocks. So I'm going to add a blend node here, plug this guy into the top, Control click to add this guy to the bottom. And so now what I'm going to do with that is come down to our blending mode and just hit multiply. And that's going to allow us to keep all of the edge information from the rocks here and not keep any of the excess information that we don't need. So I'm going to add another blend. I'm going to drop in a uniform color and bring this down into the blend. I'm going to do a little bit brighter of a white, more of a mid-gray, and I'm going to take our mask and plug that into the opacity. And you can see now what it's going to do is just mask off all of the edge wear. And we can come back in and play with our levels to maybe decrease that amount. That is not too pronounced. And now coming back into our blend, I'm going to change the way that this blends over top of our albedo. And I'm going to come down to overlay, and it's going to be a very, very subtle edge wear effect where it's just going to kind of lighten the edges of our rocks. Now that we've done that, I want to go ahead and add a little bit of our shadow information to darken some areas to just kind of push the effect of our albedo. And so I'm going to add a blend node again. And I'm going to come down and add an ambient occlusion node. And so I'm going to take this guy here because we already have all of this information, and I'm going to plug that into the blend. And you can see right now we're having the issue of plugging in a grayscale node into a color node. And so with that, all we need to do is add another gradient map. And I'm going to bring this guy up over top here. And so the issue with this now is that we're only seeing our albedo or our ambient occlusion map. So I have to come back into the blend, come down to multiply to get rid of all the white values. And now we're going to just get the darker values from our ambient occlusion. Now the problem with this is that we have a little bit too much shadow information, and it really is working inversely of the effect that I like. So it's very important at this step that we remember to really decrease the amount of ambient occlusion, and it's only going to be a subtle difference between our maps here. Because we don't really want to simulate any shadow information in our albedo, we just want to darken some of our lower colors to really highlight and push the effect. And normally I keep it at around 0.1. And that's looking pretty good. And so before I go ahead, I just want to come back to our tile sampler because I realized that our ground's looking kind of sparse. So I'm going to go down to where we have our mask map threshold here. I'm going to bring that down to about 0.2. just to add a little bit more grass back to our material. So now that we've got our albedo out of the way, I want to go ahead and work on our roughness map. And so just like we did for the edge wear of the rocks, I want to draw some more edge information to just start us off. So again, I'm going to use our normal map here, and I'm going to use a curvature smooth, making sure not to click on that and add a curvature smooth there. So I'll plug that guy in, and I'm going to take this and plug this into our roughness and just get rid of that. And so that's already looking kind of neat. But the problem with our curvature is that the darker values are going to be glossier and the lighter values are going to be rougher. And in certain areas of our material, that's not going to work. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to add a levels node onto it. And I'm just going to simply invert our inputs. And so right now I really want to be looking at our grass here, because this is where we're going to be working on primarily for the time being. You can see that we've got a little bit more darker values, so it's going to be a little bit glossier, and you can see when I crank up the dark values, we're going to get very, very shiny grass. So I'm going to decrease the black output just a little bit. Bump up the white value a little bit more, and maybe even the mid. And I might decrease the white, because we still want to get some nice specular grass. That looks pretty cool. So now I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to take our initial curvature smooth and plug that in to the background here. I'm going to take our levels here and plug that into the foreground, because I like the color values for our mud here of our initial curvature smooth, but then I wanted to invert those with our leaves here, our grass. So again, we have a mask that I'm going to be able to blend between the two, and that is our initial height mask here for our grass. So I'm going to take that, plug that right into the opacity, and so now we're going to get kind of the, I guess, mix or the blend between those two. So now I'm going to take this and plug that in. So we get the nice kind of glossy mud, but also the nice more kind of matte but still relatively glossy grass. I also want to add some variety to our dirt here because of all those miniature different specks that we added in the albedo. I'm going to just click and drag these and move them down. I'm going to add another blend, and I'm going to come back up to where we had our white noise here, and I'm just going to take this and plug this into our blend. I'm going to play around with some different blending modes. And I'm going to go with soft light, and I'm just going to, again, decrease the opacity down. It's going to be a very subtle effect. And not too subtle though, so I might increase it. We'll go with maybe settle on 0.7 there. Yeah, and that's looking pretty cool. So now what I want to do is, again, take our mask here, plug that in, but I want to invert it. So I'm going to add an invert grayscale so that it's only going to land on our dirt. So I'm going to bring this guy over just so that we keep it relatively the same area. And the last thing I want to do is I want to add some variety to our rocks here. So I'm going to add another blend, come over to where we have our rocks masked off, and plug this guy into our blend there. And I'm going to add a directional warp. And so what I'm going to warp is if I come into our noises here, I'm going to take our B&W spots 1 and take this in and plug that guy in there. And I'm also going to add a Gaussian noise and plug that in. And I'm going to really ramp up the number of intensity here. So I'm going to try 200. And that's a little bit too much. I can also decrease the scale on that. And then I can plug that guy into our blend. I can also decrease the opacity there. Again, having our rocks a little bit darker because we want them to have a little bit of gloss. And that's looking pretty cool.